Thank you everyone for hopping on. We're just letting folks trickle in and we'll get started soon. Okay, how do you guys feel about getting started? Okay, great. Welcome everyone to another session of RebPsych 2020 Decolonizing Mental Health. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Srija. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a medical student at Yale and part of the RebPsych organizing committee. I am a South Asian woman. I have a long black braid and a navy long shirt today. Firstly, we have live closed captioning available. Thank you, Christy, Christine, and Kate for your help transcribing. Instructions have been posted in the chat on how to access the live captioning. To access the captioning, you can select Show Subtitle on the closed caption or more menu. And to view a full transcript, there's a separate link if you prefer to see the closed captions in a separate browser, and a link for that should be in the chat. I want to start tonight's session by acknowledging that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugasset, Neantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is called the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. This acknowledgement is but one step, recognition, and we look forward to using this platform to further explore decolonization. This series aims to broadly explore what decolonizing mental health looks like. And last week, we discussed decolonized approaches to the mental health industrial complex. We will drop a link where you can find information on and sign up for our upcoming 4 sessions. Videos and transcripts will also be made available to registrants. I am thrilled to introduce Laura, who will be presenting Mad Folks in Activist Spaces, Tensions, Challenges, and Opportunities for Radical Inclusion. Laura Cornwall is a performing arts manager, theater producer, and disability ability advocate and activist. She has a BA from Oberlin in dramaturgy and stage management, and an MFA from the Yale School of Drama and Theater Management. Between degrees, she's worked in New York, managing Mercury Glass Theater and other indie groups. While at Yale, her efforts shifted increasingly towards disability work, leading to the formation of the group DEFY, Disability Empowerment for the Yale School of Drama. That strain of her work is what brings her here today. Now, before I let Laura take the platform and take the show from here, a few housekeeping items. Laura will present first, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. We'll have a feedback form that we will share via the chat, and look out for that because we want to hear your input. And please feel free to use both the chat and the Q&A functions for questions and discussion. We do have some discussion ground rules. We encourage people to share their thoughts and take space, but we also ask that people make space for others in the discussion. We ask that you use I statements to speak to your specific experiences rather than use generalizations. And we also ask that you be thoughtful in your storytelling and try to avoid detailing specific instances of distress or violence that may be re-traumatizing. And with that, Laura, we're very excited to have you, and please take the stage.
All right, Hey everyone. So I do have a PowerPoint that I'm going to bring up in a minute, but I first want to give you just a little bit more background about me. Again, my name is Laura Cornwall. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white, queer, mad, cis woman. I am coming to you from the Muncie Lenape land, aka East Harlem. My image description is a white, low femme queer woman with her dark hair pulled back, wearing clear framed glasses and a red and white striped short sleeve shirt. In the background is a brick wall to one side, radiator and a pipe, and a purple sheet doing the elegant job of hiding the mess that can't go elsewhere because my apartment is tiny. So I'd like to first note that while I'm speaking about neurodivergent people of all sorts, my personal lived experience is on the bipolar spectrum, which is to say with mood disorders. I'm allistic, that is, I am not autistic. I do not have any lived experience of psychosis, and I have not experienced any developmental challenges. What I'm presenting today is only part of the big picture. So again, some background about me. I'm originally from Berkeley, California, and am indeed a girl from Berkeley. My professional background is in theater. Berlin, I majored in dramaturgy and stage management. Then I moved to New York to manage and produce theater. I managed Mercury Glass Theater Company. I worked in internal operations at New York Theater Workshop. I was kind of all over the place. 4 years ago, I started the theater management program at the Yale School of Drama. And it was there that I really became a disability activist. I'd been doing mental health empowerment work for quite a while. My first episode and diagnosis was at age 13, though I now realize my neurodivergence has been lifelong. And I've been pretty vocal since that point. Claiming mental illness has allowed me to get right to the point in a lot of circumstances. And since I am a fairly privileged, I've been able to safely leverage that. But I refrained from identifying disabled because I didn't feel like I deserved to call myself that. It felt inappropriate somehow. Turns out what I needed was a deeply disabling institution like Yale. At the start of the year, the dean always gives a talk to new students about imposter syndrome, that you probably don't feel like you belong here, but believe me, you do. And it's true, I was intimidated. It's Yale, you feel that. But I've since learned a different way to see it, which is that language around imposter syndrome is often used by institutions to convince people that their perceived lack of welcome is their own insecurity, not the actual structural barriers that still exist. Because I did believe I deserved to be there, but the signifiers I got from the culture were that I didn't. The culture of exhaustion was brutal and ableism was rampant. I fought really hard for my MFA and I fought really hard to do it on my terms. Learning disability theory helped show me that I wasn't actually a failure as an artist, manager, or activist just because I couldn't do things the same way as other people. Bringing these practices into my work and seeing the impact it had on my colleagues and friends really changed me personally and professionally. I learned a lot about the power of imagination and respect. And I hold so sacred the space we created with the disability affinity group, Defy. Those fellow Crips and mad folks and queers, because these spaces are usually pretty queer, taught me so much, and it's why I'm here today. So now, give me a sec to get the PowerPoint up. All right, guys, I need tech help. It's not.
Did you hit the share screen button?
If I hit it, it tells me host disabled participant screen sharing.
1 second.
Okay.
Shrija, you're going to have to promote her to a co-host.
Got it. Let me do that. Sorry, everyone. All right. Why don't you try now, Laura?
All right. Are you seeing that?
Yes.
Fabulous. One more second, y'all. All right. So, mad folks in activist spaces, tensions, challenges, and opportunities for radical inclusion. I just want to start out saying that I use a lot of quotes because I'm still relatively new to this and really want to amplify the beautiful work of everyone but me. And all text that's on slides will be read. There's never additional information there. It's just a different way to present it. So this will be a mix of theory, practical suggestions, personal experiences, and again, a bunch of quotes. As someone with a background in the performing arts, I really think there's no way to talk about the personal without the political, the practical without the theoretical. It's all knit together. So our trajectory is we're going to talk about terminology, then some practical suggestions for increased neurodiversity in your spaces. We're going to look at barriers to access, including intersecting identities, biases and assumptions, and red herrings. Then we'll talk about radical access and inclusion, including resistance that you may face in trying to implement this work and action items to take with you. My list of sources at the end is extensive. I'm trying to cite all the different people I've learned from, both formal scholars and folks who are doing really important work on social media, which is why I've included social media handles. This will run about 60 minutes. We'll have a Q&A afterwards. Feel free to drop questions into the chat as we go. I am not keeping an eye, but they are moderating it for us. Some content discussion of ableism and saneism, obviously. I do touch on psychiatric survivors, but there is no specific example of psychiatric trauma. There's mention of police violence, mention of an activist who's very ill, and I do talk about my sort of experience and trauma from grad school at Yale. An access check-in is I will probably, first of all, I gesticulate a lot. I realize with a screen that can be intense. I probably will have to move around some. I'm accommodating a back injury. If I remember to, I'm trying to drink more water. I do have a cough that comes in and out. And I was to adjust screens, so bear with me in that. As I would say, if we were sharing physical space, do whatever you need to do to be comfortable, engage with this in whatever way works for you. One of the really beautiful things about doing more work virtually, doing teleconferencing, is that there's more possibility of being comfortable while we do our work. So a quote from T.R. Ramlow: "Queer, crip, feminist, and post-colonial studies are each motivated by a critique of binary discourses and social policies that condition subjectivity and structure society." So resisting binaries and clear boundaries is really central to radical inclusion, as well as to the very nature of madness. It's my motivation of, someone popped up for a second. It's my motivation. Got an echo somewhere, heads up, folks. It's my motivation in weaving theory into what is at its heart a talk on practicalities. All these forces are acting together. You can't understand one element without the others. Then we've got a quote from Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasina in her book Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice. It is a beautiful book, and I will be citing from it a number of times because I think she's really working in the direction I am dreaming of. Leah writes, "I think that Crip solidarity and solidarity between Crips and non-yet Crips is a powerful act of love, and I got your back. It's in big things, but it's also in the little things we do moment by moment, in all to be present fiercely as we make change." My goal is to realize spaces like that, spaces that are grounded in community, love, imagination, and opportunity. If you carry one thing out into the world from this, I really hope that it's solidarity as an act of love. Moving into terminology, each of these terms could be a whole talk unto themselves, and the list is obviously far from complete. If you're interested in learning further about any of the different things I bring up today, I definitely have resources. Hit me up. My contact info will be at the end of the presentation. But for today, we're going to touch on disability, medical model, the political relational model, neurodiversity, mad and crazy, ableism, saneism, psychiatric survivors, Crip theory, activist spaces, and access. So rather than try to pin down disability, which really just morphs through space and time, I prefer this quote from Alison Kafer's book, Feminist Queer Crip, which I will be citing extensively today. "The meaning of disability, like the meaning of illness, is presumed to be self-evident. We all know it when we see it. And then in the amazing anthology, Disability Visibility, Alice Wong writes that disabled people have always existed, whether the word disability is used or not. To me, disability is not a monolith, nor is it a clear-cut binary of disabled and non-disabled. Disability is mutable and ever-evolving. Disability is both apparent and non-apparent. Disability is pain, struggle, brilliance, abundance, joy. Disability is socio-political, cultural, and biological. Being visible and claiming a disabled identity brings risks as much as it brings pride. And then I use the slash of dis/ability when I'm making a more political or academic statement. I use it less in my day-to-day life. It's really by circumstance, but the motivation started with Dan Goodley in his book, Disability Studies. He writes that disability is a split term that I believe acknowledges the ways in which disableism and ableism, and disability and ability, can only ever be understood simultaneously in relation to one another. The slashed and split term denotes the complex ways in which opposites bleed into one another, bleed and blend. So disability is fluid and it's contextual. This understanding of disability runs rather contrary to what is known as the medical model. Kafer tells us that the medical model of disability frames atypical bodies and minds as deviant, pathological, and defective, best understood and addressed in medical terms. In this framework, the proper approach to disability is to treat the condition and the person with the condition rather than treating the social processes and policies that constrict disabled people's lives. The medical model is focusing on individuals, it's focusing on normalcy, it's operating in a curative framework at the expense of societal critique. An alternative that was proposed was the social model, which suggested that disability is caused by societal barriers rather than the individual. An example used is buildings without ramps. But a strict social model ignores experiences like pain and fatigue. So Alison Kafer has opted for the political relational model. In this alternative perspective, which Alison Kafer calls the political relational model, the problem of disability no longer resides in the minds or bodies of individuals, but in built environments and social patterns that exclude or stigmatize particular kinds of bodies, minds, and ways of being. Furthermore, from Cindy Linton, when disability is redefined as a social political conditions are identified as people with disabilities or disabled people, a group bound by common social and political experience. So it's important to note that not everyone who exists under these sort of bigger umbrellas of disability identify as disabled, nor need they. In a political and relational model, we share a struggle because of how we are positioned in society, not how we may personally identify. Even if you don't identify as disabled, if you're living that experience, we are comrades. Neurodiversity folds right into this relational model. Autistic activist Nick Walker defines neurodiversity as the diversity of human brains and minds, the infinite variation in neurocognitive functioning within our species. Suzanne Antoinette argues that this neurodiversity acts as a positive force in human evolution, enabling alternative and creative ways of thinking, knowing, and apprehending the world. There is some backing this up, both in humans and also in other species. Nick Walker continues that the neurodiversity paradigm is an emergent paradigm in which neurodiversity is understood to be a form of human diversity that is subject to the same social dynamics as other forms of diversity, including dynamics of power and oppression. So from there, we get neurodivergent and neurotypical. Neurotypical folks have minds that operate in the ways deemed normative by our society. Neurodivergent folks have minds that operate in a whole beautiful array of other ways. It includes people with dyslexia, with traumatic brain injuries, with madness, and much more. If your brain is coded as working differently than normal, you are neurodivergent. This grouping of neurodivergence gives us comrades because our specific experiences and needs may differ, but we share a struggle against neuronormativity. So what is madness? First, it's important to note, per Jeffrey Room, that no mental illness, madness, or any other term. There's no such thing as a way of referring to me and my folks that isn't in some way politicized, because our very existence is politicized. That said, current terminology includes psychiatric disability, mental illness, cognitive disability, intellectual disability, mental health service user or consumer, neurodivergent, neuroatypical, psychiatric system survivor, crazy, and mad. As to why mad, Margaret Price explains that as with queer, the broad scope of mad carries the drawback of generality, but also the power of mass. Additionally, mad is a really broad historical sweep. Psychiatry, with its focus on chemistry and brains and drugs, is relatively recent, but madness has existed, writings on madness have existed for as long as humans have documented their lives. It is through all of human history. And those of us who identify as crazy or mad, as I said, are making an active choice. Margaret Price writes in Mad at School that in naming myself a crazy girl, neuroatypical, mentally disabled, psychosocially disabled, in acknowledging that I appear, as a colleague once told me, healthy as a horse, yet walk with a mind that whispers in many voices, I'm trying to reassign meaning. In the best of all possible worlds, I would refuse to discard terms, refuse to say which is best. I believe in learning the terms, listening to others' voices, and naming myself pragmatically according to what the context requires. I believe that this is language. I will also add that the use of MAD is tied but not limited to the MAD movement, which was a response to the carceral psychiatric industrial complex. I do not have the space to go into it today, but I really do, once the recordings and transcripts are available, I really urge you to check out last week's RebPsych presentation, Critical Mental Health and Liberation Psychiatry, Decolonized Community-Based Approaches to the Mental Health Industrial Complex by Stephanie Lynn Kaufman and Sochi Cartland. Those two did excellent work and really delved into these sort of nuances. So at a basic level, ableism is discrimination against disabled folks, but it's really much thornier than that. I really like Talila Lewis's said, ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, colonialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's appearance and/or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, to be disabled to experience ableism. As Dan Goodley puts it, ableism is an ideal that no one ever matches up to. And that's the thing we're not meant to. Ableism is an important arm of the white supremacist capitalist model. It is wielded to prevent any imaginings of new ways of being. Saneism is essentially ableism focused on neurodivergence. It's a form of systemic and systematic discrimination and oppression of people who have been diagnosed with psychiatric disorders or who have or are perceived to have mental differences or emotional distress. It is essentially the punishment and repression of neurodivergence. Imani Barbarin tells us that agents of white supremacy count on society's existing behaviors towards the mentally ill and to aid and abet their agenda without anyone taking a closer look. So saneism in practice looks like discrimination in housing and employment, looks like conflating mental illness with violence, when in fact people diagnosed with psych disorders are 12 times more likely to be victims of assault than the general population. And 50% of victims of police violence are disabled, the majority with psych diagnoses. Obviously, these statistics get yet more dire when you take into account race, queerness, other disabilities, class, and immigration status. Those same vulnerabilities come into play around forced or coerced psychiatric intervention. Such interventions are frequently weaponized, especially against people of color, which leads us into psychiatric survivors. Psychiatric survivors are individuals who have personally experienced human rights violations in the mental health system. Another term that's used is consumer survivor ex-patient. Again, I'm not going to go deep into psychiatric trauma as it can be deeply triggering, and we also don't have the space for that today. But again, I urge you to check out the presentation from last week. It's also important to know that there are people who still engage with the psychiatric system, but in active resistance. I certainly identify as one of those people myself. I use medication in an active conversation with my doctor, but I also fight tooth and nail to keep myself and my loved ones out of institutions. So tying all of this together is Crip Theory. Rather than get into the weeds of theory, here are just 3 quotes as a sampler of all that Crip Theory has to offer. From Alison Kafer, To claim Crip critically is to recognize the ethical, epistemic, and political responsibilities behind such claims. Deconstructing the binary between disabled and able-bodied, able-minded requires more attention to how different bodies and minds are treated differently, not less. From Carrie Sandahl, cripple like queer is fluid and ever-changing, claimed by those whom it did not originally define. The term Crip has expanded to include not only those with physical impairments, but those with sensory or mental impairments as well. Heather Sykes tells us how Crip theory replaces the narrative of objection with a narrative of attack. Dan Goodley also expands on that the explicitly subversive anti-normative perspectives of queer theory sit well with some of the language of disability politics, pissing on pity, disabled and proud. Crip theory is celebrating and troubling disability and identity. So what do I mean by activist spaces? Broadly, I mean any space, virtual or physical, occupied by a person or group that considers themselves involved in activism, justice, anti-oppression, or any other political social work. That said, these broader concepts really apply to all spaces. If it's a space where you care about having neurodivergent people, it's a space I'm talking about today. Spaces that we share while apart include teleconferencing, phone, email, forums, social media. Physical spaces we share range from the very casual to the very formal. Meals, meetings, actions, protests, parties, other social gatherings, all that stuff that we can do much less of these days. In this era of greatly increased digital interfacing, there's some things that are important to remember. First, from the incredible deafblind lawyer and tech designer, Haben Girma, technology facilitates connections when both parties are willing and interested in practicing inclusion. Her point being that unless people are invested in connecting with one another, it doesn't matter that the technology is there. And that's certainly true with the ways we use Zoom. These sort of opportunities like having pronouns in our names, having email signatures that specify access needs around communication, increased captioning, all of these things are excellent if the culture is motivated to actually take advantage of them. The other thing is that knowing someone is working from home doesn't mean you have greater access to them. Boundaries are still really important. Often the idea that I know you're just at home means you must not need as much time between events. You must not need breaks. You must have nothing else to do. Just not true. Make sure you respect boundaries no matter how you're interacting. So, all of that said, what do I mean by access? My conception of access is built out of a comparison from Katie Rose Guest-Priall in her book, The Mind Interrupted. She says that the accommodations model requires us to disclose our disabilities. It requires us to explain, to give up secrets we might not want to share. The accommodations model depends on invasions of privacy to work. Accessibility, alternatively, means that a space is always 100% of the time welcoming to people with disabilities. Accessibility means that accommodations are integrated into a space and are not particularized to an individual, but rather created for our society as a whole. When I talk about access, I mean the idea that a space should already be welcoming to people with varied needs. They shouldn't have to ask for it. Priall also notes, the key is not to solve all problems, but to deepen and broaden the channels of possible access. Indeed, the idea of something being fully accessible does not exist. If it's fully accessible for one person, it is probably not accessible to another. There's no such thing as an absolute. It's all an active practice and generosity. I will go further into the ethos of radical inclusion and access later, but first I want to go through a far from comprehensive list of practical ways you can support the neurodivergence in your sphere. I've grouped them into communication, physical space, and social dynamics. So it seems really basic, but asking preferred contact methods is an early opportunity to indicate that you recognize people have different ways of operating. It normalizes the idea that there isn't one default. And bonus, you are more likely to actually be able to reach people if you know what's most comfortable for them. Give us information in advance, as much information as possible. This includes content warnings. Even if you think that there's nothing triggering, tell us what's going to be in any media that's being presented. Also, any information about access of the space. This includes things like temperature, stairs, whether there's seating, all that jazz. If there are agendas or other reference documents, attach them. If there are cultural expectations, spell those out. You can't predict everyone's needs and triggers, and we don't expect you to. But if you give adequate information, we can prepare for them. We can anticipate. Likewise, build time buffers and other flexibility into your plans. Assume that people need that buffer. It will make things more comfortable. People communicate in a lot of different ways, so try mixing up your methods. That includes both changing forms, like email versus in-person conversations, stuff like that, but also changing language modes. Simple language can be a huge help for all manner of people, just like using graphics can, or using video or other things. Additionally, in activist spaces, there often is a lot of priority put on theory and academic texts, many of which are really inaccessible to people who benefit from simple language. So consider whether you're prioritizing theory is actually a block for neurodivergent folks. So systems and expectations, this varies a lot depending on the space. I'm thinking especially of more formal spaces like meeting others. Social cues are subjective and can be very hard to read, and often activist spaces move at a quick clip that leaves neurodivergent people behind. Practicing different ways of speaking and sharing time can make space for neurodivergent people. If you haven't thought about who determines the pace in your group, now is a great time. Some suggestions for altering sort of the normal MO include having a talking totem, having time after questions for everyone to gather their thoughts, keeping a living document of running concerns and ideas that people can add to throughout the process, having shared signs, either hand signs or cards you hold up. There's a lot of different stuff. And all of these are practices of Crip time, which I will go into more in a moment. Feedback is rarely considered in spaces outside the formal structures of work, school, and other institutions, but we give informal feedback to each other all the time. And often neurodivergent people give feedback in non-normative ways that get dismissed or ridiculed. Margaret Price suggests that feedback is usually understood as case-specific concerns voiced by individuals. Instead, we should consider feedback in a larger sense as information coming back to us about our practices at various times and through diverse channels. The goal is a community where people are open to starting dialogues with one another. Access check-ins are really simple, and it takes the onus off the disabled person to carve out a space for their needs. I did an access check-in at the very beginning of this. It took about 2 seconds and means that I am more comfortable engaging in what I need to do in front of you all, because I said it up front. Checking in about access benefits everyone. We all have bodies, we all have minds, we all have needs. So, physical space. A behaviorally flexible or friendly space looks like neurodivergent people who are able to fidget, stim, move around, eat, whatever, operate as they need to. Different people focus differently. I, for one, can only focus for longer periods if I'm able to do some sort of drawing. All of the illustrations throughout this presentation in my PowerPoint, those are all taken from my notes from grad school, either in class or meetings. Similarly, different people have different bodily needs. Directly related to my madness, I have to take my meds with food, I have unpredictable nausea, I have to drink a ton of water, which means I have to pee all the time. In mainstream spaces, attending to any of this draws uncomfortable attention to me. In disability spaces, I don't feel conspicuous. I just attend to my needs, and it's really awesome. If you're in a place, neurodivergent folks specifically, if you're in a place to take the risk, modeling the behavior yourself can really shift norms. This is certainly how I operated at YSD. In classrooms, the way was comfortable for me, and over time, people got used to it and it was fine. But I was also in a position where that was safe to do. Have places to sit. Doesn't matter what the space is, have places. And make sure that some of those seating options are fat friendly. If all you have are like normal sized chairs with arms, your fat comrades are screwed. Make sure there is room for them. Fat phobia is very rampant in activist circles. I also suggest if you can have pillows for those who prefer the floor or are trying to mitigate pain. should be available, identified, and as degendered as possible. Obviously, a lot of times you're using a space that belongs to a bigger organization. You can't just make changes. Art Equity did teach me their workshops at Yale. We learned, check with the people whose building it is. Maybe if you have the run of the building, you can just change the bathrooms to be gender neutral. It's worth having those conversations. Regardless, if you can't offer all gender neutral bathrooms, make sure to identify where all the single stall restrooms are. Same goes for restrooms that folks with mobility aids can use. Ease of access to exits. If you're in a big building, this includes signage leading the way in. Have warnings for high sensory elements. These include, but are not limited to, flashing lights, no light, loud music, smells, cramped space, very warm, very cold, and so forth. Communicate clear ways to anticipate and avoid those triggers. Often it doesn't need to be, you can't come to this, but instead is, there are going to be 3 specific moments that you'll want to step out of the room, or the quiet space is here. And the way to then manage that is have an access point person at the event. Have someone where I know if as a neurodivergent person, I come into your like big chaotic event, there is someone I can go to ask about my access needs. Avoid scents. They're an access barrier for many neurodivergent and disabled people for a lot of reasons. Provide written copies of things that are spoken. Make sure they're clear and easy to read. I will also add that there's some very cool dyslexic friendly fonts out there now. The quiet space is one that I get a lot of pushback around. It looks different in different spaces, but in all cases, it's a quiet, low stimuli environment to which the neurodivergent activist can escape and collect themselves. Ideally, it's comfortable, welcoming, and has water, snacks, something comfy, fidgets, and in an ideal world, plants. While a beautiful, elaborate quiet space is awesome, it doesn't take that much to make the space exist, and its mere existence is a huge signifier that you are thinking about the needs of neurodivergent people. So, socially, interrupt sanist rhetoric, including your own. In activist spaces, a lot of our enemies get coded as crazy. I have even done that, and I identify as crazy. So it's important to think about who you're coding that way and why. Are there awkward people who you're coding as dumb or awful when in fact they're just different? If behavior is being criticized for being weird, question if that's just sanism. I'm not going to get into all the sanest things people say about us because it's a long, awful list. But think critically and read what different neurodiverse people are saying, including from different perspectives and backgrounds. Practice asking event organizers for their access info, even if you don't need it. If you see someone's hosting an event and they aren't listing the access elements of it, ask them. A lot of times people don't put it at all because they're afraid of getting it wrong. And that's the thing. None of us are perfect. This is a continual effort. And if you're afraid to be imperfect, you're blocking people out. Keep inviting us, even if we cancel. I canceled on most social events when I was in grad school. But it meant the world that my friends, including a number of people watching, I love you all, they kept inviting me. It showed that they remembered me and valued me, that they didn't hate me for canceling, that the space was always there if I felt up to it. It makes a huge difference. Again, be okay with people not being still. If you create a space where neurodivergent people are comfortable behaving in the ways that work for them, you'll find that the whole group is operating better, and you'll benefit from the unique talents that many neurodivergents can offer if they can exist in their own best world. And yeah, if something's genuinely disruptive, definitely talk to people about it. But first ask yourself whether it was detrimentally disruptive or was just bumping up against the status quo. Honor bodily needs. Again, many disabled people don't have the luxury of being squeamish or ashamed about our bodies. Honor our realities. Be mindful of substances. This is a big one. Alcohol and caffeine carry a lot of cultural weight, and too often group activities are organized around alcohol or coffee, tea. So if you have events like that, make sure you're offering alcohol-free and caffeine-free options. And especially around alcohol, try to hold some social events that do not have alcohol for our sober and otherwise non-drinking comrades. And obviously, don't shame sober folks. It is completely reasonable to not be consuming alcohol or caffeine. Avoid toxic positivity. Don't try to force happiness on us. Allow us to live in our natural states. If one more person tells me to smile, I may snap. And when I say flexibility, again, I mean being enthusiastic, not just willing, rather than operating from a place of it's good enough. Just focus on asking, how could this be better? Believe us. Seriously, it's a whole slide because please believe us. No matter how much you do or don't understand our needs and experiences. The number one struggle as mad people, universally, is that people don't believe us. Our reality is interrogated and ignored. We are gaslit and shamed. We are told we're wrong about things we know to be the truth. It's exhausting having to justify your own life experience. Every person living in a marginalized body knows this to be true. For those of us with madness that may cause breaks from reality, being gaslit is both extra scary and extra offensive. Even in crisis, believe us. I want to add, I don't have time to get into community health support and madness crisis management outside of the psychiatric industrial complex, but know that it's a really rich area and important for further learning. The willingness to learn and invest in community support is an access measure of love that you could offer to a mad compatriot. But even without that training, trust your neurodivergent comrade. Believe what they say they need, and if they don't want to engage with the psychiatric system, do all that you can to protect them from it. And even when we're not in the room, believe us. All of us mad folks know that people say a lot of things behind our back. Challenge it for us. Believe us. This is, as I said, this concept of Crip time from Alison Kafer. Oh, it looks like my internet is unstable, so if it somehow disappears, I apologize. Central to all of this is the concept of Crip time from Alison Kafer and Margaret Price. Crip time is a reorientation of time. As Margaret Price explains, adhering to Crip time might mean recognizing that people will arrive at various intervals and designing events accordingly. And it might also mean recognizing that people are processing language at various rates and adjusting the pace of a conversation. It's this notion of flexibility, not just extra time, that matters. Crip time is flex time. It requires reimagining our notions of what can and should happen in time, or recognizing how expectations of how long things take are based on a very particular mind and body. We can then understand the flexibility of Crip time as being not only an accommodation to those who need more time, but also, and perhaps especially, a challenge to normative and normalizing expectations of pace and scheduling. Rather than the clock, Crip time bends the clock to meet disabled bodies and minds. I am calling for a reorientation of time. I'm calling for activist spaces to think differently about time. So why is this so hard? At a really basic level, people don't think about it. Even in activist spaces, disability slips through the cracks and neurodiversity rarely even comes up, which means that people who need it don't know how to ask for it. This is a sanist culture bogging us down, and as discussed, sanism sits at the intersection of many different identities. Some reflections on the role of race, gender, and other axes of identity in disabled and mad spaces. From Isabella Kress-Nash, understanding the historical connection between racism and ableism should lead to a connected effort to disable these systems of oppression. The ultimate goal of meaningful inclusion for the disability community will never be fully realized until Black and Brown people are free. Robert McGruer asks, who haunts the margins of the work that we do? The margins. What would an ongoing commitment to those spectral presences entail? And Mia Mingus tells us how ableism cuts across all of our movements because ableism dictates how bodies should function against the mythical norm, an able-bodied standard of white supremacy, heterosexism, sexism, economic exploitation, moral religious beliefs, age, and ability. A space can't be inclusive if it's not recognizing and reckoning with these elements. A useful graphic for explaining intersections of privilege and marginalization is the Wheel of Intersectionality from Jesse on defeated. At the center, we've got unique circumstances of power, privilege, and identity. Around that are other aspects of identity, like fertility, refugee status. Yes.
Real quick, some folks are saying they're having a hard time with the cutting in and out. Would you mind trying to see if maybe pausing your, like turning off the video will improve that?
Sure thing.
Thanks. And sorry for the interruption.
No worries.
Let's hope this works.
All right, I'll go from here.
Perfect. Thank you.
Cool. So at the center, we have the unique circumstances of power, privilege, and identity. Around those are other aspects of identity. Around that, then, are identities. Around those identities are identity-specific oppressive forces. So that's where we have things like racism and homophobia. And then around those forces are the larger societal focuses, such as the economy, capitalism, war, and education systems. And a side note is that Jessie is currently traveling across the country to get life-saving surgery. So we are holding space for them and hoping that they are able to reach care. So thinking about group dynamics, it's important to ask who has power and who is setting norms. Often, if there's one person doing too much of that, there will be oppressive power structures in your group. Establishing a community space requires a shared understanding of the space's goals and values. If we don't establish clear goals, it's easy to fall into the same oppressive systems we face from society writ large. When challenged in these spaces, our defense mechanisms have been honed by the capitalist white supremacist world, and it's easy to snap back into familiar oppressive paradigms. Breaking this down requires trust, which goes many layers and generations deep. It's important for us to remember, fellow white folks, that disability doesn't equal family. Some red flags to look out for. Again, anyone speaking as the voice of authority, speaking for the group. Criticisms of people's approaches to life and health, not letting people make their own choices about their own bodies. The dismissal of trauma is a big one. Again, neurodivergent people often aren't believed. And that is the same for many other marginalized groups. And anyone weaponizing mental illness. When I say that, I am thinking especially about a trend, particularly on social media, of white women who, when called out for saying racist or otherwise problematic things, use their mental illness as a shield, use that as a justification for what they've done. This is incredibly dangerous and toxic. And especially for other white mad folks, it's up to us to shut that nonsense down. Additionally, in the resources you are using as a group, make sure there are things from disabled people of color. They are voices you need. Audre Lorde reminds us, do not let the differences pull you apart. Use them, examine them, go through them, grow from them. Conflict really can be healthy and valuable if approached directly and empathetically. Keeping these forces in mind, what are some of the biases and assumptions that arise when neurodivergent and neurotypical people share space? This neat division of sane and crazy comes up a lot. Often neurotypicals really want a distance from crazy people, really don't want to acknowledge that there isn't a clear line. All of us can slip into madness. There's also a problem.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just one other thing. Would it be possible just to bring down the pace just a little bit for some folks?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. And sorry for the interruption again. Go on.
Well, I'm about how to do this, and I do talk a mile a minute. It's an effort for all of us. So the MAD community does a fair bit of policing of one another. This has to do with what often gets called the oppression Olympics, who has it worse, whose illness is worse. And the idea of a division between sane and crazy furthers that. Additionally, there are cultural expectations that are different in different societies. Things that may read as neurodivergent in one space are normative in another. Presumed access to diagnostic information is another one. First of all, not all MAD folks have access to or want a diagnosis. Its diagnoses are very useful in specific circumstances, but can also be wielded against people. Also, we shouldn't have to share personal information in order to be believed. That's not necessary for applying, for providing access. Knowledge of a person's diagnosis or general sort of disability status doesn't mean they've provided consent for you to just ask whatever you want at any time. It's really important to honor consent with information like this. If I have let you into that circle, I'm expecting you to respect that. Neurotypicals need to practice just not asking. If someone needs something, don't ask why or what's going on, just okay. And neurodivergents, I really encourage you to practice not offering additional information. I'm not going to be able to be there today. Thank you for understanding. That kind of thing. Mary on Instagram, Invalid Art, has stated, I think entirely correctly, that liberation can only be achieved in spaces where consent is held sacred. Lots of neurodivergent people have no interest in a cure. The idea of curing is very much in the medical model, and approach to wellness is really personal. Allow us to share how we navigate the medical industrial complex. Often people think that they can tell or predict how we are or will be doing. That is false. Many neurodivergent folks are excellent at masking. Often it's a defense survival mechanism that just clicks in without us even intentionally choosing to do that. We can share something without sharing everything. Just because you have heard something about our health doesn't mean you have all possible information. And disabilities change day to day, year to year. Sadness, laziness is a huge issue in activist spaces and is what has pushed a lot of neurodivergent people out of these spaces. Susan Wendell really hits the nail on the head that fluctuating abilities and limitations can make people with chronic illnesses seem like unreliable activists, given the ways that political activity in both disability and feminist movements are structured. Commitment to a cause is usually equated to energy expended, even to pushing one's body and mind excessively, if not cruelly. This culture of exhaustion is incredibly prevalent in activist work. The idea of urgency above everything else. It's certainly why I dropped out of a lot of those spaces. So think about whether you're coding people as lazy because they take the time they need. Madness isn't solely mental. Neurodivergence comes with a lot of physical components for a lot of people. This is certainly true for autistic folks. There's a lot of great work on sort of the holistic experience that autistic folks go through. Medications also come with a lot of physical side effects. That is certainly a big aspect of my disability. The idea that every problem is because of illness, nah, we're still full people with flaws who make mistakes and face challenges in the world. Boiling identity down to illness really sucks. On the flip side, that no problem is due to illness or ableism. Navigating our illness, both internally and society, can be our life. Leila Lakshmi has a quote about Crip emotional intelligence that I hold dear. It's a little bit long, but bear with me. Crip emotional intelligence means not taking it personally sometimes. When another disabled person is short with you, is fumbling for words, is frustrated. Instead, you might assume that they just threw up for 8 hours, have been fighting suicide for a week, have cellulitis in one of their legs again, have 5 giant fibroids and are struggling to decide what treatment to try. I'm not talking about excusing verbal abuse. I'm talking about the ways in which we cut each other slack. I'm talking about the gift we give each other of seeing what the able-bodied imagine that sick, disabled, mad, deaf, and neurodivergent lives and the stress we hold from places where ableism rubs up against them till they chafe are normal. This is the norm, the default we assume is happening, rather than being oddballs who don't fit into an abled norm and have to apologize for it. Crip emotional intelligence is also not always losing it when someone doesn't use precisely the right word. It's knowing the difference between someone being a fucker and someone who has a brain injury, aphasia, extreme social isolation, or just didn't go to Oberlin. So, keeping those dynamics in mind, and community organizing. Despite faulty premises, these are concepts that keep communities in conflict. Red herrings prevent coalitions and unification across activist identities, and they maintain oppressive power structures. I'm going to be looking at high versus low functioning, campaigns that are about normalizing mental illness, and this false dichotomy of medical versus natural. You've probably heard someone referred to as a high functioning whatever, or a low functioning. This idea is rooted in a capitalist white supremacist interpretation of value, function, and worth. Productivity shouldn't be the goal. You are worth more than your productivity. This sets neurodivergent people up for failure. If you're coded low functioning, nothing is expected of or offered to you. There's no room for growth. If you're coded as high functioning, everything is expected of you, and there is no room for failure or struggle. It's yet another thing that pits disabled folks against each other, particularly as mad folks. The issue really is in our head, and the inherent subjectivity of inner life, along with the specter of sanism, means most questioning the illness, disability, and existence. Comparing ourselves to one another helps no one accept the status quo. The super Crip narrative is related to the idea of inspiration porn, which is to say, ableds getting all starry-eyed at a disabled person managing to do something. It sucks. And again, I'm just going to keep harping on it. Mental illness is super variable. Something that was easy before might now be hard. I may have developed new skills while losing other ones. That's fine. And more importantly, it doesn't matter. When we think radically about inclusion and access, we lose the need to adhere to a hierarchy of functionality. So when I say normalizing is the campaigns that we probably all have seen in doctors' offices, dorms, social service, all of that. Are you sad, tired? Here's a frowny storm cloud. Yes, absolutely, it's good to educate people. But most of these campaigns focus narrowly on depression and anxiety, which, while prevalent, erases the experiences of people with so many other types of madness. And the programs often also reinforce neurodiagnostic criteria for depression and anxiety that can leave people doubting their lived experience. These programs emphasize capitalist markers of health rather than actual well-being. They are selling the idea that mentally ill people can be, quote, just like everyone else, functional members of our existing society, one that's incredibly harmful to so many. As such, these are operating in the medical model and avoiding the structural elements of sanism. They are often infantilizing and are almost always from a very abled neurotypical gaze. They provide solutions that are often inaccessible or ill-advised. It's important to note therapy isn't easily accessible for many because of distance, cost, trauma, or lack of qualified and appropriate candidates. Medication is often prescribed quickly and casually without the full understanding consent of the mentally ill person, and is often weaponized against marginalized folks. It can also cost a ton and have physical impact. And you should always ask who's sponsoring these campaigns. Almost always it's Big Pharma. They want you on their meds. So when I say medical versus natural, what I mean is the false divisions presented between different schools of care. It's a false binary, as plenty of mad folks take advantage of psychiatry while also using interventions and care outside of the Western medical model. Says the relational model neither opposes nor valorizes medical intervention. It's not about an inherent good or bad, it's how those systems collide with other societal forces. Every human is different. Again, it's still true. Harm and trauma from the medical industrial complex is very real and entirely valid and should never be interrogated. Believe it. It's incredibly ableist to assume that we haven't made very conscious choices about our care. Seriously, don't ask if I've tried yoga or turmeric or keto or whatever. I have made the choices about my care. Dismissal of alternative or natural forms of care is often racist and classist. And it's important to note that this also pertains to, quote, illegal drugs. Allow people self-determination. Don't judge how someone else manages their pain in an ableist world. So with all these struggles in mind, again from Leila Lakshmi, What does it mean to shift our ideas of access and care, whether it's disability, childcare, economic access, or many more, from an individual chore and unfortunate cost of having an unfortunate body to a collective reimagining that's maybe even deeply joyful? What does it mean for our movements, our communities and family, ourselves and our own lived experience of disability and chronic illness? What does it mean to wrestle with these ideas of softness and strength, vulnerability, pride, asking for help, and not, all of which are so deeply race and classed and gendered? If collective access is revolutionary love without charity, how do we learn to love each other with radical access and inclusion? It's proactive, imaginative, and determined. Adina Doku tells us that what makes a space accessible is the empathy that the space engenders for people of all identities to come together. Alison Kafer says that in imagining more accessible futures, I'm yearning for an elsewhere, or perhaps an elsewhen, in which disability is understood otherwise, as political, as valuable, as integral. And from Tanya Tchaikovsky, allowing disability to spark a politics of wonder that demands imaginative and creative ways of living. So rather than incremental change to the status quo, radical inclusion suggests rebuilding and recentering. Increased accessibility tends to help everyone, and certainly changes that make spaces friendlier for neurodivergent folks make spaces more comfortable for everyone. It's about removing shame as a barrier and decolonizing access by flattening the hierarchy. Ask, in a perfect world, how would this operate? What would success look like? It's exploring how we best exist. You get a lot of resistance to this. People ask, isn't there just a checklist we can use? Nope. It's dynamic, it's alive, there's no one answer. As Alison Kafer says, the desire for clear answers, free of contradictions and inconsistency, is understandable, but I want to suggest that accessible futures ambiguities. Lack of money and resources is indeed, that's real. Scrappy activist groups often don't have a lot of resources. But most of these things are about culture and community buy-in. Specifically, I get resistance to the idea of a quiet space, but it can be made with resources that I am sure you and your comrades have around home. Yoga mat, blanket, pillow, sunglasses, earplugs. Fidgets don't have to be fancy plastic things. It can be pipe cleaners, rubber bands, all that. Phone charger, I believe, is important. A lot of us have crisis management apps on our phone, but if we can charge them, we can use resources more. Have water, have some basic non-perishable snack. This can be hard with dietary restrictions, things like raisins, granola, stuff like that. And then just a sign that says quiet place that you stick on the door. There you go. We don't have any neurodivergent people here. I call bullshit. If you are saying this, it means that psyche of your space is not being cared for. Neurodivergent people are really good at masking. Some ways I hid my disability. I would just dissociate during events rather than leaving. I would keep a running list of places where I could hide when I felt panic attacks coming on. I would stay still through events, even when it meant I couldn't focus and was exhausted later. And I often seem a-okay even when in deep distress, because that is a defense mechanism that kicks in without me even intending to. People resist the idea of pace, changing it. Again, even I move quickly. It's hard to remember to slow down. But white supremacy has taught us to value rigid guidelines, schedules, and values. To what end? Who benefits if we grind ourselves down versus if we take the time we may actually need? Again, it's important to question the culture of exhaustion and the indictment of laziness. Track if your group is valuing urgency over agency. And again, revisit the goals of the space. Why are you invested in this space and this work? Why do we need this? On top of everything I've said thus far, anti-oppressive work requires mad, disabled, and neurodivergent voices. Most changes only feel hard because they're new. Better access helps everyone. And also, we're tired of doing it ourselves. We need buy-in from people beyond us. So again, radical inclusion means different things in different spaces. It is not a checklist or a goalpost. Radical inclusion is a mindset and it's a practice. Some action I carry out into the world: listen to and learn from other neurodivergent folks. Again, I've got a long list of sources that I'll show after this. But if you reach out into any of your communities, you will find neurodivergent people out there. If you're looking for specific kinds of folks, hit me up. I might know them. Normalize access check-ins. Again, it's a way to welcome other people into your space. Normalize access to be content for that same reason. A reminder for neuro not ask for private info, and for neurodivergence to practice not offering it. Think about hard versus soft deadlines. Think about what absolutely must happen at a specific time and what actually has more flexibility, what has softness, what can respond to the needs of the people in the room. Neurotypicals interrupt sanist rhetoric. Neurodivergence interrupt your internalized sanism. This is a really hard one, but some questions I ask myself as a crazy person. How am I feeling? Who is this benefiting? Often I'm having a response because my mad self asks for something. Said, what is it that I'm actually asking for? What do I need? And most importantly, would I say this to my comrades? I'm gonna close again with Leela Lakshmi. When we reach for each other and make the most access possible, it's a radical act of love. When access is centralized at the beginning dream of every action or event, that is radical love. So again, these are the source texts that I was quoting from. I'm just going through these, so it's in the recording. If anyone needs this list in another form, can hit me up. Personal shout outs to the people who are really integral to bringing me through these last 4 years. Alex Vermillion, Armando Wiebe, Ellie Phillips, Emily Mayo, Jesse Yates, Lisa Richardson, Madeline Charney, and Philip Waller. This is my convo. So that's the presentation. I can close my window. Srija, what's the best way to move forward into Q&A?
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. You can leave your video on. And we have a few questions from folks in the Q&A. So is it all right if I read them to you and then Laura, you have Adam?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. So our first question is, how do you help change mindsets of those whose careers are wrapped up in the medical model, such as psychiatrists and employees of organizations like the National Alliance of Mental Illness?
That is an excellent, complicated question. A lot of it, I think, comes down to, again, resisting this division between the sort of medical natural. There are plenty of ways in which people who are invested in those systems, I'm thinking especially of psychiatrists and other people working in those kinds of spaces, to welcome other things as well. So rather than trying to necessarily convince those people that their system is harmful, though those are also conversations to have, I think a really useful first step is to convince them that there are other resources as well, and that when people are looking holistically at health, they actually have better outcomes.
Great. Another question is, there's been a big push by pharma to co-opt or straight up falsify patient advocacy groups in all fields, not just psych, mostly to control the narrative and promote their drug through a false grassroots approach. Do you see neurodivergent folks reclaiming these more established groups, or is the movement more to organize outside them?
So I can't speak extensively to advocacy groups in medical spaces. I have less familiarity with those, but I think, again, it's a combination of both. There is room within those spaces to make change, but I do think, especially because of the way big pharma and hospital lobbies and things like that can infiltrate, it's important to have, this is again why like radically disabled queer Crip spaces are really important, because those are spaces that things like Big Pharma, they don't have any interest in dealing with, and to for them. That said, yeah, it's a huge issue. And in the same way that we see, say, the queer movement being co-opted and, you know, queer pride is turning into companies selling us rainbow shit, like anything that is radical that is happening will try and be co-opted. I think an important thing for us to remember is if they're trying to take it away from us, that means it's doing something useful and is doing something that's threatening their established systems. Got anything else?
Great. Let me see. We have another question, or we have a couple other questions.
Mhm.
How do we ask activists to create accessible spaces with taking up space during times of crisis? I'm thinking particularly of Black Lives Matter organizing directly post George Floyd's murder, or protests that happened directly following other acts of state violence.
That is an excellent question. All of these are awesome. You guys rock. I think there are a few different elements to that. The first is that, so taking, for example, of Black disabled activists who are leading the way for that and who are saying, in this urgent moment, how can we as a community show up in ways that are safe and useful for us? So the first thing is to look to those leaders, because they are there even if they're being hidden. Especially around Black Lives Matter protests and stuff, I think Imani Barbarin is a really excellent resource. She's talked about this extensively. But additionally, it's partly about, one thing that you can bring up is if everyone's saying, okay, we have to go out into the streets, we have to do this exact, what are other ways that I can support that work? For my own safety, I need X, Y, Z. Can I offer other types of things? Making signage, posters, digital art, stuff like that can be really great for those of us who can't safely go out into the streets. And I know especially for people with multiple disabilities, given that we are in COVID times, it can be really dangerous and scary and threatening to go out into those spaces. So that's part of it. And I think also emphasizing that I'm committed to this work. I want to be a part of it. I cannot, or even saying something about how you can operate, I take it back. Saying, I think I could be really valuable operating in this way. I think that there are people who would be interested in engaging in another way. So just open, rather than, again, if people feel pushback to the activist work they're doing, they will get defensive. But if you approach it as expanding our opportunities rather than changing them, people tend to be more open to imagining those other realities.
Great. Another question, sort of in line with the previous question.
Mm-hmm.
How do we fight back against the push for urgency in our spaces, especially in spaces when the urgency is quite real? How do we navigate the guilt that can come up with stepping back, especially if we hold other privileged identities in our work? And it seems like it is our responsibility to be putting in the work.
This is one that I grappled with a lot as a white woman with a lot of privilege who has an invisible disability and was living work. This work is happening all around me. One thing I recommend is finding other folks who share both, if you can, both your privileges and marginalized aspects. I found talking to other mad white women really useful because I was able to process through sort of the guilt that I'm feeling, the complicated feelings, without putting that on someone who is doing lots of other work themselves. I think the way to fight against the urgency is, again, to propose that yes, while things are urgent, this work is not going to end. Like, we all know that the activist work we're doing, where, surprise, it's all solved, everyone can hang out now. It requires that urgency. It's good to have people who can be right there on the, like, they're the vanguard, front lines, ready to show up. But it's also good to have people who are caring for and tending to their energy, are making sure that when those people who are on the front lines come back, that they are coming back to a space of warmth and love and support and resources. So again, I think like the urgency is incredibly valid, and people operating at that clip isn't wrong. It's about saying there are other ways too. How can we also operate in a way that won't be detrimental to us? Because if fighting for important rights is also causing a lot of harm, that's not a sustainable practice.
Great. Another question, and this is shifting gears more to, rather than in activist spaces, but in medical spaces. How could you provide examples of how neurotypical folks could help mad or neurodivergent folks when they enter hostile medical spaces? Examples could be when medical professionals block access to care or meds, or don't trust their neurodivergent patients.
Again, this is something where, like, I realize that this conference is connected to, and I don't have a lot of experience in that. But what I can say, well, so one of the things that is very tricky is that in COVID times, people can't bring in other sort of support people with them, because often that's having patient advocates who are just right there is really helpful. I think an important thing is, like with asking how someone prefers to be contacted, trying to, if the neurodivergent person is able to communicate verbally, talking with them that way, but just like asking, is there a way you prefer to communicate? If it seems like they're not communicating verbally, you can bring in like cards and say, is writing things down better? Things like that, just to make sure, because a lot of the difficulties that particularly like autistic folks and folks with developmental disabilities face is that they communicate in a different way. People in the medical complex don't understand how they communicate, and so therefore don't believe them. It's also important to think, if someone seems to be in distress, if they are like crying or screaming or writhing or in any way communicating distress, it's important to consider whether it is that very circumstance that is distressing to them, and trying to intervene. Often the medical approach to someone in distress is to drug and restrain them, and instead considering, are there non-interventionist ways that we can check in and see? They might just be freaking out because there's a million people around them and there's sterile light and it's really loud and really intense. The other thing is just continuing to have these conversations. A lot of folks who are working in these spaces don't necessarily know about different models of neurodivergence, don't really think about like overlapping or conflicting diagnoses or identities, and just sort of bringing up with your colleagues, getting neurodivergence into the conversation, talking about the idea of that. I will also add on a side note that if you are working in medical circumstances, when people are not being given pain meds, because both people of color and mad folks often, because they are not believed, do not get the pain relief that they need. So that's a thing to keep an eye on. But again, if there are more specific questions about specific circumstances, I'm happy to try and answer them. Those are my sort of broad thoughts.
Thank you. We have plenty more questions rolling in. I just want to do a quick housekeeping plug. So in the chat is a feedback form. We would love to hear your input on future directions of RebPsych, so make sure you check that out. And there's also a link to sign up to future sessions. I just wanted to mention those two before sharing the next question with you, Laura. One person's asking, you mentioned something along the lines that disabled folks should not have to ask for accommodations, and we should instead create spaces built around empathy with access at the center. How do we balance this idea with the idea that many people's needs will be very individual and specific?
Excellent question. So it's about modeling behavior. So I think there are some things that universally are useful. Those are a lot of the things I went over. And because again, you can't predict all needs. As this person wrote, like everyone has different individual needs. What's beautiful about being in disabled spaces is that you see sort of the variety of ways people exist. But so if you are doing a lot of the work to suggest that your space is welcoming, you're then creating an environment where that disabled person is more comfortable asking because they know that that request will be respected and won't be interrogated. So there's never going to be a perfect time, but the more we can create a fairly welcoming space, it then becomes less of a thing to have to ask for other changes. Additionally, I would add that if you're someone who needs a specific access component and you're not comfortable going to like the head of the group, whoever your sort of fellow is in this, ask them. Ask if they know who the best person to talk to would be, or if they could talk to someone. And likewise, if you are a neurotypical person in this space, ask, like if you have a neurodivergent friend, you can ask, is there anything I can do accessible for you? So that it's not just about that same power structure of disabled person lacking power has to ask powerful person for what they need.
Great. Another question from one of our audience members was, how can you go about asking an organization about how they address access needs? And if you have examples, that would be great.
One sec. So I feel like my answer to all of these is it depends. It depends. For me, again, this is pretty new, so I actually haven't had to do this very much because also I left grad school and had a complete breakdown to deal with the trauma of grad school. So I have been unemployed and then a pandemic hit. So this is all relatively new for me still. But certainly with Yale, I spoke to my direct advisors, but then what I did is I spoke to both the dean who handled sort of EDI issues, but I also went to the disability office. In normal hierarchical spaces, there is probably some sort of HR person. They can be a good person to start with, partly because if you ask about sort of their access intentions and they are confused or don't know how to answer you, you have just gotten a big answer. If they have things to offer, they can then direct you to other people. But another way to do it is to just ask your colleagues, ask your friends, ask people who are there what their experience has been. If you are lucky enough to have disabled people in your immediate circle, definitely asking them. I learned a lot about what was going to be challenging at Yale from ill people who came before me and from people doing activist work before me. I am sorry I don't have tons of other examples, but I am happy to think.
Great. No, your examples are wonderful, Laura. And we are really, really happy that you are here tonight with us and blessing us with all your knowledge. Let's see what other questions we've got. Someone's asked, could you share further about, and this is more on the theory-based one, could you share more about the origins of disability in racial capitalism, how this affects the way in which disabled people come to be permanently marked and the boundary between sane and mad or disabled and abled is crystallized?
That is a super awesome question. I do not feel qualified to answer. Pretty much all of my theory is books that I read when I had time. So I haven't read a lot about that. That said, I know there are some really useful, informative texts. If that person wants to shoot me an email, I'm happy to build a list of some people who I think can answer that question.
And another question we have is, I really appreciated your point that we shouldn't presume someone has access to diagnosis or that they even want one. This really resonated with me personally, as did much of your presentation. Do you have any advice for navigating that in organizations or even at work? People really do expect you to be able to label your struggles to offer you leniency.
First of all, thanks. I'm really glad it resonated. It's been an important journey for me. Again, as a white woman with a fair amount of privilege, I had access to diagnoses and care in a way that wasn't particularly harmful for me. So it took a while to kind of come around to, oh, actually, wait a minute, this isn't necessarily useful or necessary. I think one thing to do is just decide for yourself what terminology you want to use, whether it's disabled, whether it's crazy, whether it's mentally ill, whether it's none of those things. Decide how you choose to identify. If you're able to say, I identify as this, my needs are this, people may try and push for diagnoses, but the clearer you are, the less likely they are to actually. So a lot of it is just about confidence. And again, my approach to all of this language is I use what's going to be most useful in that moment. Sometimes I use mad or crazy when I'm trying to really drive home a point or say, make someone feel a little bit uncomfortable about their privilege. But sometimes I use much more sort of vague dancing around it. Like, the thing is just if people really try and ask, say that, you know, I don't think that's relevant to this conversation, or that's not information I'm comfortable sharing. Alternatively, I think it's great when you can get into conversations with people about why that medical model may not be super awesome. But a lot of it just comes down to trying to stand your ground. And this is where if you have allies in that space, if you have accomplices who they can intervene, often it's really helpful to have a neurotypical person who jumps in, validates what you're saying, and sort of takes the attention off you. So I recommend trying to build a circle so that you're not having to just take all of that yourself.
Great. Now, one last question maybe we'll end on, and this is more of like a housekeeping type question, but there's been a lot of interest in your slides, Laura, and your presentation. Will you be able to make the slides available?
Absolutely. I will email them. I guess I'll email them to you after this and you can make them available to folks.
Wonderful. So thank you so much,
Absolutely.
Laura. And this has been came up in the chat to all our audience members. We will be making the videos and transcripts for all the RebPsych sessions available to registrants. And we will send out instructions on where you can access those. But once again, thank you so much, Laura, for your incredible presentation. Thank you all for attending, and we hope to hear your thoughts on tonight's session in the feedback form, and hope you join us for future sessions.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.